was promising them that if they would fight for the Crusades and they would be killed, they would be considered martyrs, and as martyrs they will get rewards in heaven. And therefore eternal life or salvation of some relative that you had doubts whether or not he or she was saved would be granted to you if you committed yourself to the crusade. Now, in the Christian tradition, we have accepted martyrdom for causes larger than yourself, particularly when they're causes related to God's kingdom, to God's commands. But we have never encouraged the intentionality of being a martyr. If you move so intentionally, there's something suspect about the whole thing, again, because life is valuable and people should live as long and as well as they can. So therefore, the only martyrdom we have kind of recognized is martyrdom that comes out of being committed to something that people exercise over you, but that you didn't really want to be one of those. So people like Martin Luther King, again, people like Oscar Romero, that were very much clear that the kind of prophetic witness they were doing could incentivize somebody to kill them. They were aware that that was a possibility, but they were not looking for that, and they would rather it not happen that way.
Yes, and in the Islamic tradition, the martyr has always had a very special place, and martyrdom is an ennobling experience because it is tied with the idea of witnessing. So one witnesses to God when one sacrifices, and so when you sacrifice small things such as, giving up food during the month of Ramadan, or the time that it takes to pray, or whatever, or giving up wealth, those are ways of witnessing to your faith. In other words, showing that your faith, that your faith is greater than the material circumstances or temptations that surround you. And so, of course, being willing to lose one's life in the effort to achieve justice or to achieve the divine will is a good thing, is an ennobling thing, and is tied to the idea of witnessing. As a matter of fact, the words are the same, or the roots of the words are the same. So testifying that there's only one God is called the Shahada, and the person who is martyred is called the Shaheed. So even the words are related. But the important thing about martyrdom is that one cannot plan for it, and one cannot intend it. One must intend life. And suffering or tribulations or death are things that just are things that might accompany the path that you're on. And so seeking death kind of undermines the process. You can't rig it for yourself. And that actually has been addressed even in the Hadith literature, where there were certain early Muslims who asked the Prophet about the legitimacy of going to war to seek the death of a martyr, and were told that that was not legitimate. Overall, Islam might be considered a kind of triumphalist religion, one that considers good fortune and success in the world to be a sign of divine favor. So if you're dying and suffering, you probably are doing something wrong. So that's kind of, and of course that's the Sunni perspective, the perspective of those who happen to be in power. Those who happen to be in power tend to think that way. If you look at the Shi'i tradition, it's quite different. And it is in the Shi'i tradition that martyrdom has actually been more developed as a concept. The early imams of Shi'ism were considered to have been martyrs because they died while they were killed while they were upholding the true vision of Islam. So there, in Shi'ism, you do see martyrdom, and as a matter of fact, overall you see a much stronger penitential tradition. So, for example, in some Shi'i communities, there is a commemoration of the death of Hussein at Karbala, and the idea is that when we mortify the flesh, which is something that we see also in medieval Christianity, that when we mortify the flesh, then we are somehow participating in the atonement or somehow atoning for the suffering that the particular figure that we are loyal to underwent. So in some ways, some scholars have drawn a comparison between the Shi'i penitential tradition and the Christian penitential tradition. But in Sunnism overall, we don't see that. So in a way, the contemporary situation where people seek martyrdom is really very much out of line with the classical tradition. Even if in the classical tradition, even if one's life is threatened, if one is told, for example, you must, we will kill you unless you kill this other person, you still cannot do that. You have to, you cannot take the other person's life. And if not taking the other person's life leads to your own death, well, then that's different. Then yes, you've been a martyr, but you obviously didn't, plan that. You cannot, the other exception is rape, actually. You cannot rape somebody and then, even if you're threatened with death, as a point of note. Just as a response to what the rabbi said, in the Islamic tradition, you can actually show idolatry. So if somebody is threatened with death unless they renounce their religion or worship false idols, it's okay to say that you have renounced God or that you are willing, that you believe in the particular idols in question. So there's kind of exception made for that. But a small point here about the overall emphasis on life rather than death in Islam is that one must save one's life even if it involves breaking a normal law. So for example, if you're in the desert, and who's in the desert these days, but let's say that you need water, you can drink forbidden things like beer, or you can eat pork, even if you're normally not allowed to eat pork. Overall, you are supposed to maintain your health to the greatest extent possible. So this is all to say that martyrdom is ennobling and a virtuous act. But seeking martyrdom, artificially seeking to rig the system so that you die, is not martyrdom, is simply suicide, which is forbidden.
Dr. Azam, you referred briefly to the Sufi tradition, and I have a question here asking about that, but I'd like to ask the other two of you. In the mystical traditions of your religion, is there a different view of violence? So can you elaborate for...
I'm sorry, but I missed one.
In the mystical tradition of of Christianity and Judaism, is there a different view or a different way of making the argument about legitimate or illegitimate violence? First, can you say a little bit more about the Sufi tradition? Okay.
Overall, the Sufi tradition, which is what we call Islamic mysticism, tends to emphasize the disciplining of the self and seeks to combat one's natural tendencies to do that which is convenient and easy and pleasing to the self. So it's an ascetic tradition. And insofar as it is ascetic, it also might be seen as encouraging or enabling a greater tolerance for suffering. And that could lead then to a tendency away